mothers who hated their children and performed acts of cruelty on them. So that was all she really could see in the role of mother was something that destroyed women. What she believed strongly was that the notion that mothers and women in general that were related to caregiving, she rejected that. She thought that was part of a myth of femininity that was used to devalue female selfhood. A lot of young men are thinking, well, why would I do that? Yeah, why do it? Right. I don't get any credit for it at all. I'm not going to likely be able to get married and have a family.
Hi, Janice.
Hello, Tammy. How are you doing?
I'm good. You're in Vancouver, right?
Yes.
How's the weather?
Well, it's finally good. We always have a late spring, but summer has arrived now, so it's really pleasant.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Well, we have some rain today, but it's been warm. And, Toronto has pretty warm summer.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that up north, though, coming from Quebec, there's a lot of smoke. So
yeah.
So we'll see how that is. But we have had some thunderstorms and rain. So sometimes if they have that, then that's helpful.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We've had lots of fires, though, hey?
Yeah, there's been a lot out in Western Canada as well.
Yeah, so your air though is pretty good. Your air
well,
quality?
I haven't noticed any change in the air quality.
Good.
One day, a couple of weeks ago, David and I were walking in the trails around our house, and somebody said, "Too bad about all the smoke," and we didn't even notice it. So maybe we're just not very sensitive.
Yeah, I'm very sensitive to smoke. I lose my voice as soon as there's smoke.
Wow.
So. We'll see how we're going up there on Wednesday. We'll see how I do, if I have a voice or not.
Wow.
If I don't, it'll be a quiet holiday.
Right.
That's okay. So today we're going to talk about Simone de Beauvoir.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she is a very interesting person, both in terms of her personal life and general philosophy of life, and especially in terms of the treatise about womanhood that she wrote, called The Second Sex. And as most of your listeners may know, she was the Parisian intellectual and philosopher and novelist. She was the lifelong companion of Jean-Paul Sartre. And she wrote a treatise called The Second Sex. It was published in 1949 in French. And translated into English in 1953. And that's when it began to have its impact in the Anglophone world. There wasn't a very good translation. Apparently, a much fuller and more accurate translation was published in 1990. And she's thought to have written the most influential book in 20th century feminism by far. Second wave feminist luminaries like Kate Millett and Betty Friedan have both talked about how much the second sex influenced them. And you can see it actually in some of the primary doctrines. So Beauvoir can really be understood, I think, as the woman who inaugurated the modern feminist movement. And, so far in our conversations, we've looked at the 19th century and very early 20th century feminist movements in the United States and the UK. And in those cases, we saw that a lot of those women were extremely angry, portrayed themselves as victims of male brutality, had nothing good to say about the patriarchal societies that men had built, saw that there could not possibly have been any benevolence or desire to protect and provide for women in the societies that men had created, and even were willing to perform acts of violence, especially in the case of the suffragette bombers and arsonists. But those women did have specific grievances that they could point to. They did not have the right to vote, and there were certain limitations on the professions that they could enter, though those limitations were falling in the late 19th century. But by the time we get to Beauvoir in 1949, all of those specific limitations are gone. Women have the right to vote, came a bit later in France. But by the time she's writing in the late 40s, women are able to vote. Women have economic rights that are equal to men's rights. They can enter the profession. So in a way, it looks as if the feminist movement's reason for being has sputtered out. But Beauvoir confronts that and says, yes, women do have legal rights, and yes, they do have political rights, but they still have challenges to overcome. And so she referred to the myths of femininity that were limiting in her estimation. And so that's what she talks about in the second sex. And it is a huge book. It clocks in at 750 plus pages, very densely argued. It has a huge first section that looks at the whole history of patriarchy and all of the myths of the feminine that were produced throughout that history, which are what Beauvoir says are holding women back. And then the whole second section is called lived experience. And there she really gets at what she believes is at the core of the women's problem, which is that everything in society enculturates the girl and then the woman into inferiority. And that's the idea, this notion that all of culture imprints femininity as a system of inferiority on the girl and the woman. That's the central theme that gets picked up by people like Betty Friedan, who complained that in her book, The Feminine Mystique, which is essentially taken from Beauvoir, Beauvoir talks about the eternal feminine. So in 1963, Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, which is all about the same thing. She's saying, well, women have the opportunity to go to university. They have the opportunity to pursue whatever profession they want, and yet many don't. And so she was trying to say the exact same thing, that there's this whole culture out there that convinces women they should do something else with their lives. And Friedan was very concerned about that. And then we have Kate Millett, who also said she was very much influenced by Beauvoir. And her special interest was the family as the site of oppression that enculturates the girl into inferiority. So we can talk a little bit about what they had to say if we have time and feel like it. Mm-hmm. But maybe we could begin by talking about Beauvoir's life a little bit, because yes. I think that's pretty interesting. And I know that that's something that you're interested in. So I made a list of things that I thought were interesting about her. And I'll just remind me of these. One is she was a rebel. She hated the feminine role. She was an atheist. Her education shaped her in particular ways. She valued promiscuity. She was engaged in the sexual abuse of her own students, at least it's been alleged, and she was very much attracted to communism. So I want to go through each of those because I think they're all kind of interesting. One, she was a rebel, and that I think shaped her from a very early age. She grew up. She was born in 1908, grew up in Paris, and her parents gave her a typical conservative Catholic education, and she hated it. And so from the get-go, she saw herself as somebody who was resisting everything about her upbringing.
Did she have brothers and sisters?
She had a younger sister. Yeah.
And her parents, how were they well off, or what did
they do? They were relatively well off. I don't really know much about them.
Like middle class people.
Middle class people, upper middle class, bourgeois. I mean, the name de Beauvoir, it clearly isn't a lower class name. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, they were able to give her a good education at a private Catholic girls' school. And so she was in rebellion against all of that. And she actually said that she wanted never to be the thing that she felt she was being bred to be, which was a housewife or a mother. And in fact, throughout her writing, she expresses repugnance at the idea of motherhood. She never did become a mother. And in fact, I don't think she was a housewife in any way either. I think she mostly lived in hotels. So that was how she got around that particular piece of drudgery. Her whole philosophy contrasted what she saw as the male opportunity for what she called transcendence and the female confinement to what she called immanence. Transcendence was the opportunity for creative self-fulfillment. So you did your work, and through the particular thing you chose to do, you created something that left a legacy that was yours personally. And she felt women, on the other hand, were confined to just the everyday, repetitive chores of basic, keeping life alive, keeping a house clean, keeping children alive.
What did she know about
meals.
that? She didn't have any children.
Well, she didn't have any, but she
knew nothing about that.
Yes, and it's really interesting, and we can get to that later too, but throughout the second sex, there is this conviction that child rearing is a particularly unfulfilling and soul destroying sort of task. So
sounds like her mother maybe might have had some resentment or something. Somebody turned her against it.
Yes, she definitely rejected the entirety of the feminine role. She admired her father. She admired her father's intelligence. And so that was the path that she chose for herself. And, as someone who styled herself an expert in femininity, it's interesting that she doesn't seem to have ever spoken to any woman who loved and desired to be a wife and mother, and who really relished that role. In the book, she has a whole chapter on motherhood in which all she talks about is the dullness of that kind of life, and she even seems to relish detailing mothers who hated their children and performed acts of cruelty on them. So that was all she really could see in the role of mother was something that destroyed women and wasn't even good for their children. So that's a big part of the anger and the sense of frustration that goes into the second sex. A couple other things was that she at age 14, although she had been up until then a fairly pious Catholic, she rejected her faith and decided that she didn't believe in God. So at that point, she started becoming interested in philosophy, and she was searching for a philosophy of life that would satisfy the hole that was left by her decision to abandon Catholicism. And when she met Jean-Paul Sartre and began studying philosophy, she eventually studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, in the very elite university in Paris. She was very interested in his notion, or the notion that Sartre and others were developing of existentialism, which I wouldn't want to be examined on it, but it's the idea of living your life, the word is authentic, living life authentically, which I think means essentially that you don't accept any of the inherited customs and mores of your culture. You create your own principles and philosophy, what works for you. And so in her early 20s, she became an excellent student at the Sorbonne. She passed second in her exams in philosophy. She came second to Jean-Paul Sartre. And at that same time, when she was studying for the exams, she and Sartre established a romantic and sexual relationship, and they fell in love then, and they remained companions for, I think, their whole lives. But they pledged to one another that they would have other lovers at the same time, because they didn't want to, pin one another down.
She was into freedom. She was into freedom.
That was the big thing. Yeah. And so freedom in their sexual lives meant deliberate unconventionality. Eventually, Beauvoir taught at a school, and she had many affairs, including with quite a few of her students. And in fact, in just a few years before she published The Second Sex, the parents of one of those girls complained about her because she had seduced their 17-year-old daughter. She was by this point in her mid-30s. And that was quite a standard practice for Beauvoir. So in pursuit of freedom and personal liberation. And a number of those students came forward in later years to say that they felt that the relationships they'd had with Beauvoir, and she often introduced those girls to her lover, Sartre, as well, and they'd have sort of threesomes so, to me, it sounds pretty dodgy. I don't know any of the details, but a number of those girls did come forward in later life to say they felt that the relationships had been sexually and psychologically abusive.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So there's that whole element of her and also the attraction to communism. Both she and Sartre were very much interested in the idea of remaking the human person by changing the person's conditions of life. They visited the Soviet Union and they visited Mao's China in the 1950s. And that is that's kind of a running theme amongst many of these utopians and revolutionaries, this conviction that human nature itself can be remade. And I think Beauvoir definitely believed that. And in fact, that's part of the reason she wrote that book, because she was encouraging women to remake themselves free of the shackles of the family and patriarchy and everything else. So that's her. And I guess, in some ways, a typical leftist revolutionary utopian. Right. And she was the first writer to situate feminism as an idea, or women's rights. She didn't even call herself a feminist at that stage, but she was the first to situate writing about women within the currents of leftist high theory that were popular at the time, and particularly in relation to existentialism and in relation to Marxism. So from existentialism, she gets this idea of living authentically, and from Marxism, she gets the idea of different groups sort of at war with one another, with
oppression and.
Yeah, that whole idea of the oppressor, the oppressed, the victim mentality, all of that kind of thing. So
yeah, it's funny, if she went through the myths, that she never found anything about the feminism. Mary Harrington would say the feminism of care instead of the feminism of freedom. She was totally a very, very, very smart person, obviously.
Right, she was, yeah,
but biased to only look in this direction of freedom, because there is another side to things that is care. Obviously, you care for your elderly, you have to care for your children, you have to care for people in poverty, but she took that as an economic oppression rather than something that needed care. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she would have said, she probably would have responded to that by saying, on the contrary, she was very much interested in care. And she would have said that what she wanted in the future was a politics and a philosophy and a social environment in which men and women were essentially not undifferentiated, but in which they participated more equally in caring, which sounds good. And although it's not clear, how children would be cared for, maybe through collectives, that was also a very popular leftist notion. She certainly, what she believed strongly was that the notion that mothers and women in general had any particular association with caregiving or any particular qualities or even, biological necessities that were related to caregiving, she rejected that. She thought that was part of a myth of femininity that was used to devalue female selfhood and to restrict what women could do in the world. So that, I don't think it was that she didn't realize that caring was important, but she was so bitterly convinced that it had been used against women to deprive them of life possibilities, that she just always had that negative frame.
Right. Well, when she gave up Catholicism, she would have given up the divine feminine that was described in the Bible as Mother Mary's position. So
yes,
that would be the end of that.
Yeah. And she does have a very long section in the first volume of The Second Sex where she talks about those as limiting myths that hurt women. So that was one. Certainly the image of holy maternality that we find especially in Catholicism, in many Orthodox branches of Christianity, she found that quite repugnant. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So then she develops this idea in The Second Sex that she has really three main planks that I think become foundational for much of the feminism that follows, that flourishes starting from the 1960s in the Anglophone world. One is this notion that woman is the other of man. And we'll talk about that in a second. But when I was a student at university in the 1980s and 90s, that was everywhere. Every single feminist talked about woman as the other of man. So that comes from Beauvoir. The second one is the notion of the social construction of femininity, that it's culture rather than anything biological. We can talk about that a little bit too. And the third is that it's the family that does the primary work of this negative enculturation, and also sexual and love relationships with men that then further this imprinting of inferiority onto the girl and then the young woman. So, and all of those three are taken up by feminists like Friedan and Millett and Robin Morgan and Andrea Dworkin and all sorts of people, all of whom said they read Beauvoir and were influenced by her. So she had a huge impact. So the first one, woman as other, it is, very influential formulation. And what she means by that is that women are not only understood to be different from men, which, she would have agreed, yes, women are different from men, but she didn't entirely reject biology, but we'll get to that in a second too. But basically it was this idea that man was taken to be the representative of humanity. So she said it wasn't like two opposing electrical poles. It was that man was both the positive and the neutral, and woman was always defined only in relation to man, never in terms of her own essential selfhood and her own essential difference as a female human being. So, and that has proven hugely influential, in all thought that followed her for the next 50 years. Mm-hmm. So she basically, and she said, this notion of self and other, though that is absolutely crucial to most categories of thought. And it's not surprising that men defined women in relation to themselves or saw women in relation to themselves. But she said that women as other were different from others in the sense that, you could say, well, slaves have been defined as other, blacks have been defined as other to whites, Jews have been defined as other, the working class is defined as other. Like there are various groups that you could say are also othered. But she said for those groups, it was a fairly straightforward process for them to, come to an awareness of themselves as an oppressed collectivity, because they shared things. They shared a common identity in some way. They shared maybe a common language. They shared common economic circumstances. If we're talking about the working class, they shared a common ethnicity, maybe a common language. And so in all those different ways, those groups could see themselves as a collective, whereas women were intimately involved with men in all aspects of their lives. And they were very different from one another. An upper class woman, very different from a working class woman. A Jewish woman, very different from, a French woman, that sort of thing. And so she felt that this meant that women had a greater difficulty in establishing themselves as resisting subjects because of their intimate relation to men. Mm-hmm. And what is so striking about this, like, I don't totally disagree with her.
No.
About.
It's challenging.
Yeah,
it's challenging for sure. It's one of maybe our biggest challenges is our intimate relationship with men.
Mm-hmm. And she recognized that many women felt a special allegiance to men. Many women took pleasure and, in fact, took their whole identity from caring for men. Mm-hmm. And so that was obviously, if your purpose is to liberate women into freedom, that's a big issue. But the thing that's so striking about that is that she never once in this very long treatise ever acknowledges that the relationship between men and women, as it had formed over the centuries, that there was anything in it that might have been benevolent on the part of men, that there ever could have been on men's part a determination to protect women, that the way things developed over time was a result of the necessity of creating social structures that would protect women and children in a perilous world. She absolutely doesn't acknowledge that.
What about men going hunting, bringing back a carcass and having the woman cook it? Mm-hmm. Was that not a relationship that worked for her?
Yes. I mean, all of those basic things. The fact that if you were living in a culture where men had to hunt, that you would obviously want the stronger men, the stronger human beings rather, to do that. And you would want to protect the women because it was a perilous activity where people could be harmed or killed. Well, obviously you wouldn't want your women doing it because your women were crucial because they were the ones who were bearing the children and raising those children like that. That's so obvious. And yet she doesn't acknowledge that. She acknowledges it, but she never sees it as grounded in male care for women. Mm-hmm. She says there were 3 reasons why it developed in the way it did. She said one was just basic brutality on the part of men, that they were bigger and stronger. 2, women were confined to their reproductive function. But 3, and the part that she's most interested in, she believed that men took pleasure in dominating and got their sense of identity from that. And that's all she could ever see. So she strongly believed that, she even has, I have a quotation that I wrote down. Yes. She says men needed to dominate, and that's where they got their identity. She says, quote, "One of the benefits that oppression secures for the oppressor is that the humblest among them feels superior. The most mediocre of males believes himself a demigod next to women." So that's what it comes down to. It was never that fathers were concerned about their daughters. It was never that the husband was concerned about his wife. It was always that the weakness in man took pleasure in being more powerful and being able to dominate women. And that's where he took his identity from. So, when you start with that, such a jaundiced, bitter, cynical perspective on how things developed as they did, then of course you can't see anything worth preserving in that system. You simply believe it has to be destroyed and some superior system erected in its place. So yeah. So the whole of the section, the second section called Lived Experience, is her explanation of how this oppressive and degrading state of affairs comes to be reproduced in every generation.
Now, the birth control pill, it came out around 1960, right? And you said the book was 53 was when it was published,
when it was translated
into English. So that was very close to the time that the pill was available.
She doesn't, I don't think she talks about, she speaks specifically about abortion as something that needs to be available to women. And in fact, in the early 1970s, she was one of hundreds of women in France who signed a declaration saying that they had had abortions at a time when it was illegal in France. So she definitely sees abortion and obviously birth control itself as absolutely necessary to the ideal of freedom that she's elaborating.
So that would be, that sounds like a me philosophy.
Yes.
All about me.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And she does have nice parts in the book where occasionally where she says that she doesn't believe that there will always be animosity and suspicion between men and women. She does say that she imagines a future point where men and women will come together in a relationship of reciprocity and mutual recognition. So that part sounds really good. Although, how that's going to be possible given everything that she has to say about who men are in their kind of essential selves and the sort of world that men built for women over the centuries. I can see what it means, and I see that in modern feminism too. It's yes, at some future point we'll be able to live together without rancor, but you're going to have to pay now for all the horrible things that you did to us over the last centuries by taking a secondary role for as long as we say you have to. I mean, that I think is really what the message of modern feminism is to men now. Oh, sure. Yeah, we want equality, but we don't have it now. And you ruled us with an iron fist for so long that it's time for us to rule you for some decades or even perhaps centuries until we say that it's now time for us to live as equals. And so I think that is kind of at the core of a lot of the anger that comes out in Beauvoir's treatise.
Right. And we can see now that women are at the age now they've been educated and they are in positions of influence. Mm-hmm. And how are things going now? Everybody can answer that for themselves. How are things going now? It's not a pretty picture.
No, and I think what Beauvoir would say if she were still alive, she died by the way of problems relating to alcoholism. That was another thing I was going to mention. She became an alcoholic later in life, so her philosophy of personal freedom and authenticity didn't actually prevent her from needing to rely on alcohol and drugs to get her through her days. But I think what she would have said was that we still don't have equality. Doesn't matter if women are in positions of power. And this is what we hear from feminists over and over again. Absolutely doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you can show that women are doing better. Generally, it doesn't matter if 60% of university students are female. It doesn't matter if 52% of PhD graduates are female. It doesn't matter if the legal profession is now majority female. It doesn't matter if the medical profession is majority female. None of that matters because we still have these myths and these ideas about the feminine that are holding women back. And they'll always be able to point to one area where there still isn't a majority or equality, at least, between men and women. But that idea that there is some kind of invisible force, ideas that allegedly convince women that they're inferior. That is something that feminists got from Beauvoir. She got it from Virginia Woolf to a certain extent. And it's brilliant because you can never prove that it doesn't exist.
Well, we can maybe now look at the birth rate, because there's a new movie out called The Birth Gap, and he does a great job of visually showing the low birth rate in Japan and Korea, and moving west and into United States. It's mostly on the west coast of or on the east coast of United States, but I thought it was a shocking story about the fact that women have left the home. They're not having children, and they've left their communities, so that the home life, and the small community life is not flourishing anymore. So they have gone to the work, for sure. Women have gone to the workplace, absolutely, for sure, because they aren't at home. They aren't at home, and they aren't in their communities anymore. And it's obvious now that they've left, and the family is decaying, and so is the birth rate. So,
Yeah.
If they want to win that, they
did.
They're winning. Yeah.
Yeah, they did win that. And certainly Kate Millett, felt that the family was absolutely what needed to be destroyed in order for women to be liberated. She has whole chapters in her book, Sexual Politics, which came out in 1970, where she talks about that very specifically. And Beauvoir would have seen that as, I'm sure she would have seen it as a victory.
Yeah.
Because her repugnance at what mothering did to women was so strong. Yeah. So, so that's the, woman as other. And then, so the other major idea that she developed, which we also are seeing the fruits of in our modern culture now, is this notion that, not exactly that there's no biology, but her most famous expression was, woman is not born, but rather becomes woman. There's also this idea that womanhood is a process of becoming. It's it's not clear. Nobody knows now exactly what she meant by that. And in some ways it's a nonsensical utterance, although it's been called the most famous feminist statement. And queer theorist Judith Butler said, it's so key because it articulates the notion that gender is a performance. It's not something that is innate. It's something that one acquires through culture, that one learns to act out rather than what one, naturally expresses. Nobody knows if that's exactly what she meant by it or not, but it certainly was picked up by later feminists, and it's now flourished into the notion that anybody can be a woman or a man, that gender is an artifice. It is something that we act out because we have a cultural script, that cultural script now in the transgender movement, of course, is available to anyone who wants to choose it or who wants to make their own cultural script and be neither male nor female, or perhaps be fluid. Many, I think, anti-trans feminists are regretting the enthusiasm with which feminists seized on this idea that all of gender is a construct in a way. Yes, it wasn't a totally new idea. It's there at the very, very beginning of feminism. If you read Mary Wollstonecraft way back in 1792, she was saying something similar. She said that, basically you could never know what a woman was until women were given freedom to, determine their own identities. And so you couldn't say whether a quality was innately feminine or not, because that quality had been imposed through social circumstances. So if you took away the social circumstances, then women could be completely different from what they appear to be now. Interestingly, that freedom is never extended to men by feminists. Feminists always say that men are just innately as they say they are. They are brutal, they are aggressive, they are oppressive, and that is simply taken to be an innate characteristic. But so anyway, so Beauvoir really emphasized, and it wasn't exactly that she said that biology doesn't matter, but she said that the biological fact of sex, that we couldn't really determine what it was because it always took its form in a cultural context. And so that's this sort of slippery way of saying we absolutely can't know anything for sure about sex. Because the family and all these other cultural institutions are what force human beings to adopt certain gendered roles. So, and she says things like, here's a good example of how she argues. She says, even something basic like the difference between male and female biological, like the fact that men are generally stronger than women. You can measure, hand grip. You can measure
Shoulder
upper body strength. Yeah, all those things, muscle mass, bone density. All those different things. That's pretty undeniable. But even there, she accepted that, but she put it in this different context. She said, when the physiological given, in this case, muscular inferiority, takes on meaning, this meaning immediately becomes dependent on a whole context. Weakness is weakness only in light of the aims man sets for himself, the instruments at his disposal, and the laws he imposes. That's a quote from her. Now, I don't know what that means, really. It was a fancy way of saying really not very much at all, except basically that, she accepted that there was such a thing as natural difference between men and women, but you could never really know what that natural difference was because there was always a culture that intervened to mold our understandings of those differences. So she was really interested in what culture makes of nature. And that is a legitimately interesting thing because we know that across cultures, femininity and masculinity are expressed somewhat differently. But, it's also very interesting to keep in mind what nature makes of culture, how nature influences culture. And that she was not interested in at all. So you can see this really marked emphasis on the primary role of culture, and that's been standard in feminist conceptions, ever since Beauvoir. So she has this whole long second volume in the book where that's what she's detailing. She basically argues that from the moment a child is born, culture begins acting on that child to gender it. And that if we could only change culture, the child might be gendered in very different ways. Now, I think this is wrong. I think, again, I'm not a biologist, as the Supreme Court nominee is famous for having said recently when she wouldn't define what a woman was. I'm not a biologist either, but if you read a book like Stephen Rhodes's Taking Sex Differences Seriously, he cites hundreds of studies, literally, that show that even at a couple days old, a male baby responds to certain stimuli differently from a female baby, long before you could say that culture was playing its role. So, this notion that everything is cultural seems demonstrably wrong. But that was her position, essentially. She says, at one point, she says, if well before puberty, and sometimes even starting from early childhood, the female child already appears sexually specified. And she says, it is not because mysterious instincts immediately destine her to passivity, coquetry, or motherhood, but because her vocation is imperiously breathed into her from the first years of her life. So that's a totally social constructionist position. Everything gets breathed into the child. There's nothing in the child that destines her to motherhood. And, this is still a very popular idea. A friend of mine sent me an article like a couple days ago by a Canadian researcher. The article was written in French, so unfortunately my French is not good enough to read it, but he translated the title and the gist of the argument, which was that the so-called maternal instinct, this researcher claims, is entirely culturally conditioned, that there is no such instinct. It doesn't exist in
so this
beings.
is a new paper in what discipline?
Do you know? Honestly, I didn't even look into it. I'm not sure. I can send you the
I have a French
information
friend.
about
She's
it.
a psychologist. She could
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, my friend who sent it to me was just aghast, and I didn't really look into it at the moment because I was doing other things. But yes, and he laughed and said, how do the birds and the right. whales, etc. How do they know how to raise their young? But yes, she was arguing that at least in human beings, the mothering instinct is not an instinct at all, but a social construction. So that's been a very dominant strand. And now that we have trans athletes moving into women's sports, and there are some women quite upset about that. I hear all sorts of strange arguments saying that this is just another patriarchal plot to ruin things for women.
Right.
But it was there in feminism for decades being asserted. I have read articles claiming that the only reason there are sex differences in sport is because men don't want to admit that women are just as strong as men, and just as swift, and just as agile, and just as accurate, and all of those things. I read an article claiming that, and so feminists have for decades denied that there were differences in strength and speed between men and women, and now we see the results of that in the trans phenomenon. So that's the other major idea that Beauvoir developed, and then so she goes on then to prove that the destiny of the girl is breathed into her in culture through this long section, which is mainly anecdotal. It's mainly her own experiences as a young child, and her insistence that every single thing that a girl experiences growing up is designed to confine her and to limit her and to make her accept that she is lesser and secondary. And it's one of those things where she has this predetermined conclusion, and everything is forced into the framework that she has already chosen. So, for instance, she talks about the fact that in childhood, boy children actually tend to be treated more harshly than girl children, that often they are allowed a much more limited range of behaviors and expressions of emotion. They're told quite early on about, they're punished quite harshly for wrongdoing. They're told not to cry, if they respond by crying. Just in general, often parents favor girl children. Now,
my experience with it is that when the kids were little and under 1 year old, when they were just starting to explore, and sometimes they would get themselves close to an outlet or an electrical outlet or something, and you have to say no. My daughter, I would say no to, and she would stop. My son, he would stop, but then he'd say, "What about here? What about this close to it? Could I go this close to it?" Right, and so.
Classic no,
masculine. The no with him had to be firmer.
Yes. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Mm-hmm. The boundary testing.
Yeah, the boundary testing, always. It was always there. It was very interesting, right from the beginning.
Yes, interesting. Well, she's not interested in whether the reason parents behave that way would have that kind of
Anything
a basis
to do with the kids.
Yeah. Of course not. Because, parents are they're just agents of patriarchal conditioning. They're not actually responding to their own children's natures, and they don't actually care about their children as individual little human beings. So she says, they're harsher with sons than they are with daughters. Mm-hmm. Now, you might say, well, maybe that means, I don't know what you might say. You might say that means they value them equally but differently, and they know that they're going to grow up in a world that's going to treat them differently, and perhaps that would have something to do with it too. Or it might be, something very practical and specific like what you just described. But what her explanation of it was that's because they already know that the boy is destined to grow into a man who's going to be able to do all sorts of wonderful things. He's going to be able to confront his destiny. So they're harsher with him because they already have higher expectations, where they don't have any expectations for the girl. So they don't care about developing her character, her toughness, her resilience, her stoicism, or any of those things. So every single thing, no matter how small, that she believes she has observed or experienced in her own life becomes evidence that parents are expecting their boy to be something, and they don't expect their girl to be anything at all. And she has this strange conviction that every young man somehow has this glorious destiny, that he's going to be able to do something to fulfill his deepest desires for selfhood, whereas no girl is going to ever have that opportunity. She never imagines that a lot of young men are destined to lives of drudgery and difficulty, that much of the work that men have always done in the world is not fulfilling at all, that it's dirty and smelly and disgusting and
risky,
damaging. Yeah, exactly. And again, that's something that still really bothers me about so much contemporary feminist thought, is that it seems that these women, they look at men who are at the very, very top of the social hierarchy, and they think that, for one thing, they don't imagine any of the work and the self-denial and the self-sacrifice and the even, obsession that has gone into getting men into those top positions, the hours and hours and hours taken away from things they might prefer to have done, or simply the fact that they had this preoccupation, this obsession, that's what made it possible for them to achieve the position they've achieved. They don't see that. And they think that position that those men have achieved is one that all men somehow occupy. They never see the men doing the sewer work and the road work and the up on the roof when it's 100 degrees.
And the garbage.
The garbage,
and the recycling,
collecting, and all of that. Which is drudgery. It is not self-fulfilling. It's not creative. And men die, of course, on the job at a rate so much higher than women. I think 94 or 95, or maybe no, I think it's even 97% of workplace fatalities are male.
I was in a life drawing class last night, and I showed up in the male. The model was male. And the fellow who was running the life drawing session, they knew each other. And they were talking. I didn't know either of them because only I'd been there once before. And he was very fit. This guy was very fit. I find out he's a dancer, a tango dancer. So he's fit. But that's not all he does. He actually builds buildings, and there's many buildings being built in Toronto. And so they were talking about the fact of going up high on these buildings and having to be out on the scaffoldings and being 45 stories up. And then over time getting used to that. And then one other guy was talking about cleaning windows. And at the beginning, he's outside these high rises that are all glass, and you have to clean the windows. So he's out there. But he says by the end of the summer, he's reaching over and just, dangling himself and stuff. And he said, you get used to it. And I was like, yep, you guys, you do. You go out there, you risk, and you get used to it, and you get these jobs done. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And Yeah, that is something that is never acknowledged when I hear feminists talking about equality in the workplace. They're always talking about those wonderful jobs. They want the CEO position. They want to be on the corporate boards. They want the corner office in the law, department and law firm. They don't think about something that a friend of mine calls the glass floor. Feminists talk about the glass ceiling, those very upper niche kind of jobs that many women feel they've been shut out of. But there's also a glass floor, and there's all sorts of men that are working underneath that glass floor, doing those really dangerous, tough, awful jobs in many cases, working with machinery, risking themselves. And women aren't interested in doing those jobs. That's fine. We live in a society where men are still willing to do those jobs.
So far,
yeah, and get no credit for it. And
not so much now, though. It's hard to get people. I have a fridge at my cottage, and I called for a refrigerator repairman to come and maybe service it. They don't have enough people working for them. I can't find somebody to come and fix it.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
right?
I'm really noticing that too. And that's widely discussed now. A lot of young men are thinking, well, why would I do that?
Yeah,
why do it?
Right.
I don't get any credit for it at all. And I'm not going to likely be able to get married and have a family. So it doesn't really matter.
She won't appreciate me anyway.
Yeah. If I do get married and have a family, I'm taking an enormous risk. I could marry somebody who seems nice, and 8 years in, she just decides she's bored and she wants out. And then I'm going to be paying child support payments for a child or children I may or may not even be able to see. Yeah. I may become a visitor in my own children's lives. If my ex-wife is particularly malicious, she can claim I was abusive or threatened them in some way, and I may never see them at all. But I'll still have to be. She doesn't even need
evidence for that.
No. She just has to say it, and that's the end of that father. That's the end of his ability to parent his own children. I mean, it's so shocking.
Horrendous. Yes.
It's just, And,
I wonder if, Simone de Beauvoir, she had a sister. There were no boys in her family.
No.
Maybe her parents said that they wished they had a son.
I wonder.
Early, when she was very early. I mean, I don't know, but there were no boys in the family. I'm sure they were wishing they had one son, and they didn't.
Yeah.
They may have said that, and they may have said it once.
Mm-hmm.
And that may have stuck in her mind and driven her to be resentful for the fact that she wasn't a boy.
The thing about resentment is that if you give it any ground at all, it doesn't grow. It doesn't even really need anything to feed off of. Like, there are always going to be circumstances in life that can cause that sense of resentment, even if, the parents were perfect, which no parents are, of course. And that's the sense I get, like, especially reading through this whole second half of The Second Sex, like, everything that she encountered as a human being caused resentment, until that became like the ground of her being. And that's the thing, because like the fact that she admired her father and didn't really identify with her mother, you could say, that we could do a psychoanalytic reading of that and make something of that. When I think of my own childhood, I was an only child. And I think, I admired my father too. And I probably identified with my father a little bit more than my mother, although, I loved my mother a lot and had a very close relationship with her too. But the fact that I admired my father and identified with him meant that I couldn't accept feminist dogma, ultimately. It meant that every time, I did accept it at first, but after a while, I started thinking, my dad wasn't like that. Every time I would read about the family as a site of oppression, or the father and his, the way he subjugated his family and all of those things that they say. And I think my dad didn't do that. My dad worked really, really hard and provided a good life for my mom, her mother, and me. He wasn't even home for most of the summer because he was a commercial fisherman. So he was out up north fishing from June until September. And, we missed him, but we were very much aware that he was doing this for the whole family, and we all took pride in what a successful fisherman he was. He did too. He enjoyed his work. And there was nothing, it was truly reciprocal, I think. My mom held down the fort while he was away. She took care of bills, and if things needed to be repaired, she looked after that. And then when he came back, he took his place in the family, and that was a working arrangement. And so, anyway, but to go back to Beauvoir's psychology, it's so difficult. I mean, she was an intelligent woman. She felt that if she'd been born male, she would have had more opportunities. Now, she actually ended up, as far as I can tell, she lived a completely self-directed life. She achieved fame as a writer. She did what she wanted to do in her life. She didn't want to have children. She didn't have children, etc. So I don't know in what way she felt she was held back, but that sense of bitterness is just there everywhere. And it even comes out in ridiculous claims, such as that, at one point discussing how, boys and girls are treated differently. She says that, she uses a sort of psychoanalytic kind of framework. She says that boys, because in Freudian and post-Freudian psychology, the idea is that the child has to separate from the mother and lose a sense of control over the mother's body, because up until a certain age, the child doesn't even really sense that the mother's body isn't part of his body too, because it's so close, and of course he's feeding at the breast and that sort of thing. So the mother's body is the source of all comfort and pleasure and safety, and it seems undifferentiated from the child. And later on, the child has to accept that the mother is actually a separate person and isn't simply there to serve and nurture him or her. Now, she claims that in that process of separation, the boy child has his attention and sense of pleasure redirected to his penis, which he can use as an instrument of his will. And so she talks about the boy sending golden arcs into the air with his penis. And the girl child, in contrast, has these hidden sexual organs, and these make her feel ashamed. And so she talks about how she has to squat to pee, and this is somehow a representation of her inferiority, and it causes feelings of shame and resentment. And that when she gets her menstrual period, that sense of shame is increased. And, she takes it from there. She says at one point that the very fact that a girl has to hide her menstrual periods has such the evidence of it, has such an effect on her that it makes her feel that truth and integrity need never be a part of her character. It's a very, very strange thing to have said. And, I was thinking, here is an example of where culture is various in the way it treats the initiation of girls into womanhood. In many cultures, the girl's first period is treated as cause for celebration. There are ceremonies around it. It's in most cultures, it's at least accepted matter-of-factly and is not seen as a cause for shame or humiliation of any sort. So although I can kind of see the point she's making, again, the determination to see that everything in the girl's life is destructive of her selfhood, and everything in the boy's life is supposed to be, affirming his selfhood, is simply not true. She never mentions the fact that every boy grows up knowing that in a time of war, he will be expected to sacrifice himself if necessary, while his sisters will not be expected to sacrifice himself. Now, it's true that there is a certain glory associated with that sacrifice. It's also terrifying and horrible, and many boys don't want to sacrifice themselves in war. What does that do to the boy's psyche and his awareness of how he is valued differently from his sister? I think, that she never acknowledges that kind of thing. And,
I guess she never looked at how women who die in childbirth in the Aztec society were buried with soldiers who died in war.
Interesting. No, I didn't know that myself.
Guess you didn't know that. Yeah. So
yeah, I mean the complementarity, the honoring of sexual difference. She just will not acknowledge that in any way, and it even extends to at one point she talks about how in the act of lovemaking, male dominance is also asserted. You know, she says it's even in the language. He took his pleasure. He gave her pleasure. She says that this, you know, and that the male, allegedly is the one who determines the duration of the love act and the amorous positions that are adopted, all this sort of stuff. And again, maybe sometimes, I don't want to get into talking about that, but, it's not that cut and dried. And she even says at one point, like the most, I think, remarkable passage in the whole book is where she even objects to a man who is anxious and concerned that his lover enjoyed the sexual experience. She even says, and if I can find this quotation, I don't know what I've done with it. Oh yeah, here it is. She objects to any man who asks the woman after they've made love whether she had an orgasm. Mm-hmm. Okay, like I would think that would show that the man was pretty concerned about his lover or his wife. But this is what she says. She quotes the typical thing that a man says. Is it enough? Do you want more? Was it good? She says, the very fact of asking the question points out the separation between the two and changes the love act into a mechanical operation, assumed and controlled by the male. And this is precisely the reason he asks it. Much more than fusion and reciprocity, he seeks domination. When the unity of the couple is undone, he becomes the sole subject. He likes the woman to feel humiliated, possessed in spite of herself. He always wants to take her a little more than she gives herself. Like, how did she come up with that? I mean, at that point in the book, this is near the end, I just thought, well, she is either just outright dishonest in her estimation or delusional, so possessed by her own cynical theory about male indifference and subjugation of the woman that she's unable to write about this thing with any kind of truthfulness, because
sounds like she doesn't know what's true anymore by this time.
Yeah, I mean and so that's the kind of book it is, and I could find more examples, but I think the point has been made. So this is sort of the third plank in her theory of male-female relations, that everything, whether it's in the family, whether it's in sexual and romantic relations with a man, all of it is about making the woman feel her own degradation, making her feel humiliated and controlled. So even a man who cares about his lover and wants her to enjoy their sexuality is somehow oppressing her and asserting his superior selfhood. Yeah, so it's a pretty jaundiced and cynical take, I think, on human relations. And the other thing, the last thing really that is striking about the book, and by the way, I wanted to say too that notion that whatever the man does is abusive in some way. That too, I think we see so much in mm-hmm. modern. I've read articles of feminist critics complaining about what they call benevolent sexism, which is essentially what she's describing here, I think, where it's the nice things that men do for women that also evidence their sexism. Oh, so if two people who work in the same office, if they have to go to a conference and they're sharing the driving, if the man asks the woman if she wants him to take over the driving because she might be tired.
Oh, yeah.
That's benevolent sexism, because he's assuming that she's not, capable of driving. If he holds the door open or, whatever it could be.
And that is so nasty, because when you if someone shows a goodness, especially in children, but this can happen in adulthood too, but in children, if someone shows a benevolent act and you don't encourage it, instead you squash it, or you even make sure that it won't happen again. If you actually take the things that people do that are good and not want any of that to show, man, there's nothing worse than that.
Yeah.
The goodness of people.
I know.
That's really brutal.
Yeah.
To do that.
I absolutely agree. And
that's what's happening to men today.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what they do that is in a caring attitude or even a brave attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That is all put down. It's so demoralizing.
It's incredible.
It's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, it's just...
Should be illegal.
I know, really? I know. I mean,
no,
it should at least be called out for what it is, as a type of, hate speech, or whatever we want to call it, that as at least as bad as anything else that we no longer accept in our society. I mean, I absolutely agree. Like, I just feel like any woman who goes on a TV news program or stands up in a university classroom or a primary school classroom and makes these kinds of statements about boys and men and how they're exhibiting their toxic masculinity by doing X, Y, and Z. Like, anybody who even uses a phrase like that should be never had back. Should feel the wrath of public outrage in the exact same way we would do if someone said that a particular race was inferior or anything like that. Like, I just find it, like, the effects on boys and young men hearing that. And if you heard it just once, you could laugh it off or ignore it, but it's constant. It is everywhere, so accepted, applauded. Even men themselves will express these things or will nod in agreement when a feminist says them. And the damage that it does is just incalculable. There's a person, one of the male authors in my book, Sons of Feminism, he talks exactly about that he has this very strong memory of one time when he was on a university campus. He was quite a young man at the time, and he opened the door for a woman who was just behind him. And he said he did that all the time for everybody, because that was how he'd been brought up, and it gave him pleasure to do a small, kind act. And this woman got so furious, and she gave him a glare as she walked through, and she made him feel demeaned and hated for this small act of kindness. And he's never forgotten it. And it really hurt him. And, then he wasn't sure what to do in future, and he felt uncomfortable on dates as to how to behave and, all of that stuff. It's incredible.
Yeah. Incredibly harmful.
Mm-hmm. And
well, I had no idea that Simone de Beauvoir was behind the idea of other, which is behind the victimhood really in our society right now. I know it's she's enormously influential. And the last thing I wanted to say about her actually was that she also, she never acknowledges, of course she wouldn't, and no feminist ever does, she never acknowledges the forms of female power that are there even in the most traditional societies and still today in our modern, equality valuing society. Like, all of these feminists, they only recognize certain types of masculine power as power. So maybe economic power, obviously physical power, the power that's associated with masculine characteristics and behaviors. But they never acknowledge that there are also corresponding female powers, like the power to cry and get your way, the power to complain about something and have people listen and be concerned, the power to talk about a situation where you felt belittled or where you felt afraid. Those are genuine powers. And in fact, without those powers, feminism would never have gained any traction whatsoever.
women have real power, the power to accuse, the power to say that a man did something to you, and that even though nobody saw it happen, that they should take very seriously your accusation. All of those are particular female powers, the power to shame men and to make them act on the basis
we're good at
of
that.
Yeah, all of those, and those are perhaps not the powers that Beauvoir wanted women to have. She would have said that those are the powers of a second-class citizenry, but they still are genuine powers. They change the world. They did change the world in the 1960s when women got together and started complaining about things that they weren't happy about. A lot of people listened. Mm-hmm. And in a very short time, things started changing. Women started moving into the workplace, and they started complaining about things in the workplace that they didn't like. And men changed the workplace in order to respond.
Men allowed them into their clubs and their associations and their workplaces. Mm-hmm. And now women don't want men in their places, but women are in every place that a man used to be with other men. Mm-hmm. I think the only place left is maybe the priesthood. That's about it.
Yeah, they're pretty unhappy about that too, the feminists.
Yeah, I know. I went to a monastery with Jord in Austria, and I asked the monks, and they said that the women are knocking at the door always. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so far they've been able to say no. And I said, well, keep it up. Mm-hmm. Keep it up. Say
no. I mean, the idea that any place that is only for men, the idea that must be a toxic place and that it's good for women to come into that place, that is now so deeply ingrained in all of our conversations about places where men are, that men have almost no way of resisting the demand.
And I think that men need that place because when there's only men together, they organize themselves. They organize themselves for status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
They jockey for position. And because whenever you see, if you happen to come upon men or boys playing, there's a lot of teasing and pushing each other, and they're finding their place. But when there's a woman there, that's disrupted.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
And so then they're not able to form their strong associations with each other the way they used to. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I've talked to, one person who works as a psychotherapist, and he found that if you get men together, they have all sorts of particular ways that they relate to one another. They're ways that women don't even necessarily understand, but that's the way men are with one another. And sometimes they can help one another without even exchanging a word. Men like working together, rather than talking everything through. They do talk.
I interviewed a woman. She said that she walks her dog quite a bit in quite a rural area, and she sees men that they come to hunt. Mm-hmm. But there'll be 5 of them, but they'll all be half a mile apart. Mm-hmm. And so they'll park their cars, they'll go off hunting for the entire day, and then they'll come back and get in the cars, and they've spent a day together.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, men are different, and they deserve to have their own spaces too. But, we absolutely don't accept that. The other interesting thing about the whole, the invasion of male space by women, and the fact that men allowed it. I mean, that is astounding. They allowed it like in a very short time. A few men objected, but most men were more than willing to have women. Yeah. Most men like women, of course. A lot of men felt, hey, if it'll make the workplace nicer. Actually, I like women. I like working with women as long as they're competent, etc. Most men were quite willing to open up all of those various spaces. And now, of course, what's happened is that all these spaces now have sexual harassment policies. And it means that if the man makes a single mistake, asks a woman out on a date, makes a joke that she doesn't appreciate, makes a comment she doesn't appreciate, stands too close to her one time so she feels uncomfortable, she can get him in a lot of trouble. And employers are just terrified of not responding fast enough to complaints. They're willing to fire men rather than face the possibility that the woman is going to say they, were complicit in allowing a culture of sexual harassment to go on in the workspace. So yeah, wow. I mean, in a very short time, women went from demanding admittance to now saying, the whole space has to operate according to the rules that we set up for our benefit.
And I think this comes from women when they were at home. That was the role of woman.
Mm-hmm.
And she's taken what she used to do at home into the workplace, but it doesn't scale up to the workplace properly.
Right. No. And there's been no recognition that the home was often a place where women did have incredible, enormous power, and where often men really didn't have much of a place at all. There's been no discussion of making homes more welcoming for men. In fact, the discussion is the opposite. Let's get men out of the homes because men are abusers, and let's keep children away from these toxic men. It's enormous, and the hypocrisy of it all, the laser focus that feminists always have on the things where, they think they're being shut out, they're being discriminated against, but absolutely no recognition of the way that men are shut out or discriminated against. And,
I sure hope, this time now that we've come to where kids are being butchered.
Yeah.
And in the gender wars, the feminists are going to have to speak up about this. They're going to have to answer for this, and this could bring an end to feminism as we know it. It's got to, because it's such a terrible thing.
I hope so. I really do hope so.
Me too.
I'm always surprised at the ability of feminist ideologues to not accept responsibility and to say that it's somebody else's doing, and this was never a part of feminism, and feminists have had no role in, anytime you mention something, male suicide, parental alienation, men having a terrible time in divorce, whatever it happens to be, it's never any consequence of anything that feminists have advocated for. So it's very difficult, I think, to force them to take responsibility. But I agree with you that the butchering of children and the sexualizing of children that's now going on, which is directly an offspring of 1970s feminism. I do think that finally it's reached the point where there is a critical mass of people saying, absolutely not, this has to stop. So that's encouraging to see.
It would be interesting to talk about that in particular and how it is associated with feminism from the 70s.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to do that.
Sounds great.
All right. That was excellent. Again, thank you.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed it.